Lord Jesus, you're omnipotent. In your humanity, you fasted 40 days and 40 nights. Help us, give to us, exhibit through us our might, self-discipline in our work, in our walk. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, we're with Martin Luther, and the Reformation in Germany is led by Professor Charles Beard. We sort of dinged him for observing that Luther was the voice of the German nation. He kind of seemed to forget the theological stuff there for a bit. Maybe he's going to deal with it later. Luther was a theologian first, but we comment on that later. We're on page 330. Luther's appeal to the nation in 1520. Luther had ventured to allude to passages in the preface to the new edition of the Enchiridion, which seemed to be in accord with his own teaching. Both had said hard things of the monks and especially of the mendicant orders. Both were assailed by the same enemies, fighting with the same weapons. In a letter which Erasmus addressed in November 1519 to the Archbishop of Mainz, and which contains the usual protestations that he had nothing to do with Luther, occurs the following remarkable passage. Of the articles which are on the ground of objection to Luther, I say nothing now. I speak only of the manner and the occasion. Luther had dared of doubt of indulgences into which others had before made assertions but were too shameless. He has dared to speak with somewhat too little moderation of the power of the Roman pontiff, of which others, of whom the chief were three of the order of preachers, Alvarus, Sylvester, and the Cardinal St. Sixtus, had before written much too immoderately. He has dared to despise the decrees of St. Thomas, decrees which the Dominicans almost prefer to the Gospels. He has dared to discuss certain scruples as to confession, a matter in which the monks ensnare the consciences of men without end. He has dared to neglect to some extent the decrees of the schoolmen, things which they themselves attribute too much, in regard to which nevertheless they differ among themselves, and which last of all they do not hesitate to change, substituting new things for old. And it was a torment to pious minds to hear in the schools hardly any mention of evangelical doctrine, and that the sacred authors formerly approved by the church were held to be antiquated. Even from the pulpit, hardly anything was said of Christ, almost everything of the power of the Pope and the opinions of the moderns. But it did not help matters when a copy of this letter was surreptitiously procured and printed, probably by Ulrich von Hutten, who was then in the Archbishop's service. The great scholar might be pardoned for feeling that even his impartiality was being used against him, and that he was being involved at a moment which he only partly approved and was quite unable to control. A curious and characteristic story completes the picture of Erasmus's mood in these years, which we're talking about Erasmus now. In October 1520, Charles V was crowned at Aachen. Frederick of Saxony, accompanied by Spalatin, went to be present at the ceremony in his official capacity as Marshal of the Empire, but intercepted by gout, got no further on his way than Cologne. Thereby at Cologne, says Spalatin, the highly learned man Erasmus Rotterdamus was with the Elector of Saxony and talked with him of all manner of things, and was asked whether it was his opinion that Dr. Martin Luther had erred in writing and preaching, whereupon he answered in Latin, yes, indeed, in two things. That first he has attacked the Pope's crown, and next the monks' bellies. Thereupon the Elector smiled and bethought him this answer hardly a year before his death. It was after this interview or another a few days later that Erasmus, going with Spalatin into the house of the Count of Nunar, hastily committed to paper certain ox, asked for them back again, fearing lest they should bring him into trouble with Aleander and Caraccioli, the papal agents who were then in Cologne. Before a year had passed, however, the document had found its way to the press. National security leak to the 24 cable was written. It represents Erasmus's relation to Luther on its friendliest side. Erasmus takes no theological position, but advises caution, condemns the severity of the Pope's bull, sustains Luther's claim to a fair trial, and speaks with some contempt of his adversaries. Had not the tone of this paper been so completely that of Erasmus himself in more courageous moments, it might seem to have been an echo caught from the electors, and indeed, the controversy had long overpassed these bounds. It had been too much the custom to put down the attitude of Erasmus to Luther and his movement to mere timidity or selfish caution. He was a sickly scholar, it is said, whose character was cast in no heroic mold. Living on terms of intimacy with great men in the church and state, and being a big sycophant for patronages, and unwilling to imperil his position with them by avowed sympathy with the revolution, aka a sycophant, a coward. No doubt this is part of the truth, though only a small part. No, it's not. It's pretty. Erasmus was constitutionally averse to loud talk and violent action. In other words, he's not the kind of man you want to go into a theological dogfight with. We like it calm and deliberative, but we don't want cowardice in combat. Irony, not invective, was his favorite rhetorical weapon, and abuses which moved others to indignation excited him only to a mocking satire. But it should always be recollected that he had a method of reformation of his own, the method of literary culture. That up to the year 1517, this method appeared to be in successful operation, and that he suddenly found its character compromised and its issue endangered by Luther's movement. That's more like it. He tried in vain to evade the shock of theological opposition which first Reuchlin and then Luther drew upon all religious innovators. He found not only that he was charged with complicity in a line of action with which he imperfectly sympathized, but that the new reformer carried away with him all the young and promising minds of the humanist party. He never gave his adhesion to the peculiar tenets of Luther's theology. If we may anticipate the use of terms, he was upon the Catholic, not the Protestant side of the controversy. He probably saw from the first the danger, as he conceived it to be, of the theological element in Luther's movement would overbear every other. He felt that the time would come at which he'd be compelled to say, wherever Lutheranism reigns, their good letters perish. So that if he were true to himself, he could not act otherwise than he did. It is a mistake to find fault with him because he did not join to a command of literary culture, a knowledge of antiquity, and master of style, which Luther never possessed, the fiery religious earnestness, the absolute fearlessness of consequences, which are necessary to make a revolution in religion. Criticism has completely established the fact that the letters of the obscure men, which so decisively intervened in the affairs of Reuchlin, were the production of that band of Erfurt humanists of which Mutian was the head. After the publication of that famous satire, Crotus, its chief author, went to Italy. The leadership of the party silently passed from Mutian to Obenhaus, and the enthusiasms of its members transferred from Reuchlin to Erasmus. We talk about the Reformation at Erfurt now. The great humanist was in 1517 and 1518 at the zenith of his fame, and now that the crisis of Reuchlin's fate had passed, it was felt how much more attractive, how far better calculated to awaken the youthful enthusiasm were the adages, the praises of folly, and the New Testament of 1516, and the old Hebraists' mystical speculations on the Kabbalah. Became a fashion to make pilgrimages from Erfurt to the Netherlands to visit the master of all erudition. One such was made by Oben Huss, another by Justus Jonas. When Edward Lee, afterwards Archbishop of York, attacked Erasmus with all the virulence of obscurantist orthodoxy, or his contribution to theological scholarship, the Greek New Testament, the humanists of Erfurt fell foul of him, as they had before fallen foul of the monks of Cologne. Oben Hess lectured on the Enchiridion, Kraft on the Encomium Moriae. Much indifferent Latin verse was produced at Erfurt at about this time. Besides Oben Hess, inexhaustibly fertile in every metrical form, there were Auricius Cordus, who embodied his loves and hatreds in innumerable epigrams, and by both Erasmus was largely celebrated. His influence was religious as well as literary. The long letter is still extant, in which he persuaded Justus Jonas to abandon law for theology, little thinking that he was preparing for Luther, one of his most efficient and intimate allies. Shortly after the return from Netherlands at Easter 1519, Justus Jonas was elected rector of the university and commemorated the event on an illuminated page of the matriculation book, which recorded his visit to Erasmus. A more important result of that visit was the reform and the studies of the university which the new rector undertook. Henceforth, the true spirit of humanism was to prevail in them, and provision was to be made for the maintenance of lectures in the Greek and Latin classics. But a change was impending. Erfurt was too near Wittenberg not, in some degree, to catch its infection. The two universities had been closely united for some years after the foundation of the younger, and the double relationship of Erfurt to Mainz and to Saxony. John Lang, who enjoyed Luther's confidential friendship, was living there as the prior of the Augustinian convent, and though not actually belonging to the band of humanists, many of whom were his old classmates, was on friendly terms with them. And in October 1519, Crocus Rubianus, who was about to return northwards from Italy, wrote from Bologna 2 letters to Luther. They'd been friends before the latter entered into monastic life. But that event parted them, and communication between them seems to have so wholly ceased. The first letter simply gives the last news of X proceedings in Rome. The second is an impassioned proffer of allegiance. Often, Martin, says Crotus, when men have spoken of you, have I been wont to call you the father of our country, worthy of a golden statue and yearly festival. You who first dare to call away the people of the Lord from noxious opinions and to assert true piety. Go on as you have begun. Leave an example to posterity, for you do these things not without divine assistance. This was the purpose of Providence when, for the town of Erfurt, as you were returning from your parents, The bolt from heaven struck you down like another Paul and drove you from our companionship, most sad at your departure, into the Augustinian convent. And although our opportunities of intimacy after that were few, nevertheless my mind always remained yours, as you might have seen from the letter which last year I wrote to you at Augsburg, if indeed what was delivered to you. In the following April, Hutton, who had already opened the communication with Luther, of which we presently speak, met his old friend at Bamberg, and in consultation with him, no doubt, drew closer the bonds which were about to unite the Reformer with the Erfurt humanists. Alban Hess was prepared to pour the stream of his facile enthusiasm into this fresh channel. Cordus had already found matter for many a bitter epigram in the corruptions and oppressions of the church. It was significant of the change that was setting in. That at the end of 1519, the university declined to pronounce any judgment on the disputation at Leipzig. And when at Michaelmas 1520, Crotus Rabianus was elected rector, the alliance between the former reformers and humanists was complete. Now he's going to talk about the humanists of the great cities. A curious monument of this fusion of feeling, which it may be remarked in passing did not last very long, is extant in the illuminated page, which, according to custom, the new rector prefixed to the entries made during his term of office. It is entirely heraldic. The center is occupied by Crotus's own arms, a hand coming out of a cloud holding a hunter's horn, an evident allusion to his name, Johann Jager. Round this are the heraldic devices of 16 of his friends, some humanists, some reformers, who perhaps before or after found themselves associated in so friendly a contact. The four corners are held by the great names of Luther, Erasmus, Reuchlin, and Mutian. The other shields are those of Hutton, Alban Hess, Justus Jonas, Melanchthon, Lang, Henry Eberbach, Forchheimius, Urbanus Regis, Draco, Adam Kraft, Joachim Cranmerius, and Justus Manius. Underneath stands the legend, while initials EH refer to the pen of Alban Hess. But with a certain class of humanists, Luther had made his own way. In every populous German city, whether the seat of a university or not, there were men who cultivated the new learning, kept up an active correspondence with one another, and felt that they belonged to one republic of letters. Among these, both of the older and younger generation, Luther was the occasion of great searchings of heart. Some of the seniors felt, like Reuchlin, indisposed to embark in their old age on what promised to be a boundless ocean of controversy. The church, though they would be willing to see it reformed, was good enough for them, and they had no sympathy with peculiar theological opinions, which were the mainspring of the new movement. For others, Luther was more decisively exercised the function of a prophet in revealing their secret thoughts and making them conscious of their own position. Some of these were Bucer, Brenz, Schnepf at Heidelberg, Hedio and Capito at Mainz, Oekolampadius at Augsburg, were afterwards chief instruments of the Reformation either in Germany or Switzerland, men who, though at a distance from Wittenberg, owed their first religious inspiration to Luther's writings and took the tone of their life from him. At Leipzig, we find Mosellanus, a professed humanist, lecturing in 1519 on the letters of St. Paul, and declaring that all the studious youths are eager in the pursuit of sacred literature. On the other hand, Eck and Emser and Cochleus, all of whom in various degree would have a right to be counted among the humanists, found occupation and notoriety in bitter and persistent opposition to Luther. The old antithesis between theologian and poet was in no ways being obliterated. First, the new learning was conquering ground hitherto resolutely held against it by the champions of scholasticism in the church, so that to read Greek and Latin was no longer a sufficient ground of ecclesiastical suspicion. And next, the religious principles of Wittenberg had made a fresh line of cleavage. It was quite possible, with Erasmus, to love good letters and yet turn a cold face to the neutrality to Luther. It would be no good purpose to give a list of those who in all the great towns of Lower Germany and along the banks of the Rhine were either receptive of Luther's influence or preaching doctrines more or less akin to his. It may be enough to mention two cities, Augsburg and Nurnberg, each which held a Lutheran circle, while each in its own way was the center point of German commerce, an example of the finest development of civic life. At Augsburg, at the time of which I am speaking, Conrad Puttinger and Christopher Langemantel were examples of the new influence among the rich and educated citizens. Two canons of the cathedral church, Conrad and Bernard Edelman, belonged to the humanist society of which Willibald Pirkheimer of Nuremberg was the acknowledged head. Liberal churchmen who were unwilling to admit that devotion to learning was incompatible with faithfulness to the church. In 1520, Oekolampadius, afterwards the foremost of the reformers in Switzerland, was preacher in the cathedral at Augsburg, and when in that year he retired in a strange fit of devotion to a monastery, Urbanus Regis, who'd been vicar general at Constance, and before whom a lifetime of reforming energy still stretched, was invited to fill his place. And it was in December 1519 that an effective blow for Luther was struck from Augsburg. In a pamphlet which Eck contributed to the controversy between Emser and Luther, he made the scornful remark that all the clergy, except a few ignorant canons, were against the innovator. The challenge was at once taken up in an anonymous little work, The Reply of the Ignorant Lutheran Canons to John Eck, which is ascribed to one of the Edelman brothers, but was really the work of Oekolampadius, showed, much to Eck's chagrin, that the ignorant canons were quite able to take care of themselves. The book has a special interest in being perhaps the first in which the word Lutheran was publicly adopted as a party designation. I have already mentioned the sermons which Staupitz delivered in Nuremberg in the winter of 1516-17. The effect which they produced was deepened and confirmed by the subsequent preaching of Lincoln. The Augustinian convent was the center of the new movement, which spread to every class in the city. It was Christopher Schorl, who'd been a professor at Wittenberg from 1507 to 1511. Luther kept up a confidential correspondence. To Hieronymus Ebner, another of the city fathers, he dedicated an early work. Although Pirkheimer was closely connected in the persons of his admirable and accomplished sisters with the Santa Clara convent of Nurnberg, there was nothing as yet in the new religious teaching that shocked his sense of wrong or offended his prejudices. While Lazarus Spengler, the city scribe, a man whose character and great ability gave him an influence in Nuremberg, Hans Sachs, shoemaker and master singer, who stood at the head of the poetic guild, which is one of the illustrations at Nuremberg of this period, had seen Luther at Augsburg. It is recorded of him in 1522. He'd already made a collection of 40 of the Reformers' books. And in 1523, he celebrates the hero's praises in a poem, The Nightingale of Wittenberg. Perhaps in the whole of German literature, there is no more affecting passage than the entry which Albrecht Dürer makes in his diary when, as he is traveling to the Netherlands, he hears that Luther, on his return from the Diet of Worms, has disappeared and fears that he has been betrayed to his death. The dull routine of entries recording the places which he entered, the friends who have hospitably received him, the money which he spent is suddenly interrupted, and he breaks into a passion of tears and prayer, which is often stayed and is often renewed, as if sorrow and indignation could not find vent enough. It is too long to quote entire, too sacred to mutilate. We seem to hear it in the voice of the deepest religious gratitude to a quickening teacher lost forever. The cry of one noble soul to another, bound to it in the closest spiritual bonds. Two contributions to the controversies in which Luther was engaged, made about this time from Nuremberg, are at once important in themselves and curiously characteristic of the respective authors. The first published sometime in 1519 and written in German for the common people, was entitled An Apology and Christian Answer of an Honorable Lover of the Divine Truth of Holy Scriptures, upon occasion of the contradiction of some, with reasons why Dr. Luther's doctrine should not be rejected as unchristian, but rather should be held to be Christian. It was anonymous, but Spengler made no secret of the fact that he was the author. An avowedly controversial work, more charitably modern in its tone, more completely penetrated with a certain sober and modest devoutness, never was written. It produces at once the most favorable impression of the mind which gave it birth, and of the force and purity of the religious impulse out of which it sprang. The second was a Latin satire, Ecceus Dedolatus, der Abgo belect Eck, which, recollecting that Eck in German means a corner, you may translate the corner planed away. It was published in 1520. Its author announced himself as Johannes Franciscus Oekolampadius, poet laureate, and the place and date of printing are not given. It was a furious satire against Eck, not without salt, but of the grossest and most personal kind, not only making the victim ridiculous, but trampling him underfoot in the mire of scorn and contempt. It is a dialogue in the spirit, though not in the Latinity of the letters of obscure men, but full of savage earnestness, as if the writer had a private grudge to avenge and would hold no terms with his enemy. The authorship was never acknowledged, but it was an open secret that the shaft was from Pirckheimer's quiver. At all events, it was upon Pirckheimer that the insult was avenged. Eck was far too vain a man to forgive an assault which made him the laughingstock of all Germany. There was, however, another element of popular feeling which the German had to reckon, the sentiment of German patriotism, that it was vague, inconsistent with itself, without fixed object or policy, did not prevent it from being strong. The revival of letters had led to the reopening of records of the national past. The glories of Charlemagne and Otho were not the less sympathetically but uncritically recounted, and men went back to the days when emperors did not tamely submit to the Roman yoke, but themselves nominated and deposed popes. The common people, to whom these things were little more than dim legends, saw with their own eyes the expropriation of German church revenues by a foreign race, who despised while they plundered them every benefice held by a cardinal's nominee, all tax and toll that poured into the bottomless gulf of Roman avarice was felt by them as an injury inflicted upon their nationality. What these patriots wanted was a strong imperial government administering justice, keeping the peace without fear or favor at home and abroad, once more widening the empire to its ancient bounds and making it in reality the repute of the most powerful monarchy in the world. That this desire was doomed to disappointment, all subsequent German history tells with one voice. The active forces of politics worked in the opposite direction. The princes were intent upon rounding off their own territorial sovereignty. The minor nobility, the free cities, had no principle of cohesion and were incapable of united action. A plan of common taxation could be devised, which the several states would accept. Not even a powerful emperor like Charles V could force a new organization on unwilling feudatories. The ideal which the patriots had in mind was essentially one belonging to a past age, which probably no cunning of statecraft, no enthusiasm of self-sacrifice would have availed to recall. Germany was slowly moving towards the anarchy of the 30 Years' War, and the territorial disintegration of that century that followed it. But in 1520, patriotism was still a living force, for it compelled, as we have seen, venal electors to choose an emperor who, whatever his other qualifications, was at least of German blood. The man who more than any other represents this phase of national feeling is Ulrich von Hutten. He returned from Italy to Germany in June 1517, and after a few months' interval, during which he prepared for the press Laurentius Valia's work on the donation of Constantine, entered for the second time the service of Albert Mainz. And the Duke of 1519, he eagerly took part in the campaign against Duke Ulrich of Wittenberg, with whom he had a private blood feud. This was the turning point of his career. During the short war, he contracted a close intimacy with Franz von Sickingen, the celebrated partisan leader, whose history shed so strange a light on the political disorganization of Germany at this time, and induced him so to throw the shield of his protection over Reuchlin as for the moment to bring the Dominicans of Cologne to their knees. In January 1520, he was again with Sickingen in his castle at Landstuhl and endeavored to win him to the side of Luther, as he'd already won for him Reuchlin. The result was a letter from Hutten to Melanchthon, followed by another a month later, written on the supposition that the first had miscarried, and which, on Sickingen's behalf, he authored Luther a refuge in the castle of Ebernburg. A similar letter reached the reformer perhaps before Sickingen's from Sylvester von Schaumburg, a Franconian nobleman, who sooner than he should fly to Bohemia, as common report averred, that he was meditating. Luther's letters to both these new friends are no longer extant, but there's evidence enough that they put fresh courage into him. Schaumburg and Sickingen He says, the Spalatin have made me secure from the fear of men. He wishes the elector to let the Cardinal of St. George know that if he is driven from Wittenberg, it will only make matters worse, for he will then take refuge not in heretical Bohemia, but in the midst of Germany, where there are those who are willing and able to protect him. It is the policy of the hour, Hutton urges it. Crotus writes from Bamberg to recommend it. Franz von Sickingen was one of the independent nobles in the Rhineland. From small beginnings, had become a power in the German Empire by services at the court of the Elector Palatine, by a system of family alliances, joint heirships, and by bold fighting for their own hand. The Sickingens had won a position of considerable influence. And Schwicker von Swingen, Franz's father, was lord of three fastnesses, Landstuhl, Ebenberg, and Hohenberg, each with many attached fiefs. He was as fierce a robber knight as any of the medieval forefathers. This may be inferred from the fact that he laid a plot for surprising Cold and murdering its chief inhabitants, because in that city his dagger, which he was wearing in defiance of municipal laws, had been taken from him. From this beginning of the family fortunes, Franz, who had an undoubted faculty as a leader of men, went far. He carried on a great feud with the city of Worms. And here we'll bring this to an end. Glory be to the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen.